Good morning. I'm back to my morning schedule. I was actually up at 3 something, but it's taken me so long to prepare for this entry that it's about 11 minutes after 5 in the morning. First, a little bit of housekeeping. We are getting more hits, especially the last one about the dirt on Dickens, of course, I think it's up to 25 views, naturally. I am following up on that article that I read during that entry. That was a popular article without citations, but I was able to pretty quickly find most of that information in an article on the website for the British Library. So we're probably talking fairly accurate here. I've written the library and I've written the author to try to get the original source material. So far, haven't received a reply. When I send out my emails introducing my article in a couple of weeks, I will ask the author of that first article that I read from, and we'll see if we can track it down. I mean, that's the easy way. The easy way is the British Library and let them tell me where it is. If I don't get the information from them, then of course I have to try to track it down myself. I'm holding off on adding this to my sequel because instead of quoting a popular article with no citations, I'd really rather get back to some of the original sources. Now, the one or two people who were leaving troll type comments, they're smarter than the average troll, but they're trolls nonetheless. And in the general world and on the internet, I'm not able to make the case when people are indulging in sophistry. And if I try to have a discussion with such people, I'm not able to get them to admit that they're indulging in sophistry. But on my YouTube channel, I have the power to simply block such people on the basis that they are, in fact, indulging in aggressive, irrational sophistry. And that's what I've done. So you won't see those comments anymore. We lost a couple of people from the channel, so hopefully it was those two people. Now, today, this is going to be a two-parter, and there's one more little housekeeping thing I wanted to mention. When I get into my stats, I very disappointingly see that, there might be 25 people that supposedly watched an entry, but the average person is watching for less than a third of the presentation, which I understand, and I do myself, but I have to say that I keep talking until I've said what I need to say. And if you only watch a third of it, you haven't gotten the presentation, And this was the case with the trolls. They would say things that were actually answered later on in the presentation that they didn't bother to watch, But, I saved some of the best stuff for last. And if you've read my written blog, you'll see that sometimes it takes me a third of the blog to warm up to the topic. I don't actually get to the subject I wanted to talk about until I'm about a third of the way through. So if you only watch a third, you've only watched the introduction. For example, I haven't even gotten into the two topics I want to touch on today. If you click out now, you haven't seen anything. You might as well not even watch it, So I've got two things that I want to talk about here. The second one was actually the impetus for my launching an entry today. And then I got into it a little ways. And as sometimes happened, I started finding more and more things that I wanted to talk about that weren't really directly related. So towards the end of this, I'm going to present some of my photography for two reasons. One is that I'm proud of it, and I think it deserves to be seen. And secondly is that it demonstrates what inspired work is. It demonstrates that I'm capable of doing inspired work. And it also shows a tie-in with Mathew Franklin Whittier, which I actually didn't prepare. And I may or may not go back and find it, stop the video. And, I've got so much else here that I'm going to show. I may not get into that. I may just assert things without demonstrating them. But that's going to be the second half. The first half here, I'm going to go into Mathew Franklin Whittier's attitude towards Charles Dickens. And it so happens that Mathew was a fan and continued to be a fan quite late, but he had doubts and he struggled with those doubts. And it was part of Mathew's personality. He was split on this issue because he had a strong penchant for vengeance. And at the same time, he was naive, easily fooled, and he tried to give people the benefit of the doubt. So he was naive in his heart, and he would get fooled, and then he would get angry, and then he would want to get revenge. And then as a Christian, he would try very hard to turn the other cheek and to see the best in people and forgive them. So these two forces were constantly at war in Matthew's psyche. It was the case in his relationship with his brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, and it's the case with Dickens. So I'm going to give some examples of this. Now, the first time this comes up, I have to launch my Kindle here, which is a little low on power. Hopefully we'll get through. There is a letter dated February 13, 1844, and I will show a Xerox of the or print version of the original on the screen, a scanned version of the original on the screen. I don't have the physical copy. And let's see, he's writing from Portland to his brother. This is when he was into his second arranged marriage and was living in Portland. And then, let's see, he talks about wanting to buy a farm and so forth and so on. And then towards the end, he says, I sent thee by same mail as this, the last number of Martin Chuzzlewit. It is, I think, the best one which has yet appeared. The native American raw material and the, quote, American Eagle are very happily treated. I always liked Dickens' works, but since he has had the boldness to attack our foolish vanity, maugre the stuffing and feasting they gave him, he has risen much in my estimation. When I have heard the boastful language of our sixpenny newspapers and seen the absurd worship bestowed upon the memory of Washington, I have always felt that sensible foreigners must be disgusted with us. We are perhaps passable, and Washington may have done as well as another placed in his situation would, but that is the end of the matter. He was not a god, and we are not angels. Well, that's interesting. That's not that long after George Washington's passing, and you can see that, of course, that, Washington has been deified at this point. He wasn't then. But the attitude towards Martin Chuzzlewit, well, Dickens was criticizing American culture, and Martin Chuzzlewit and his popularity was going down somewhat in general before A Christmas Carol. Matthew defends Dickens, and he will continue to do so, but there will always be little hints and signs that he's not quite sure, that he doubts. There's a couple examples of that, and I'm going to show you one of them. But first, I want to show you how much he admired Dickens, because in the Odd Fellow, which is the Odd Fellows newspaper, Matthew was a member of the Odd Fellows. This is the March 20, 1847 edition of the Odd Fellow. I'm sorry, I'm multitasking here. This is it's a series called Pickings and Pencilings. This is number, I think it says it's 6, but it's actually 7. It's signed Dickens Jr. This is the way Matthew would indicate admiration for someone or influence by someone, is by calling him Junior, like the son of, okay? This is called The Cottage Flower. And what we have here is very interesting. We have someone who writes under Dickens' influence. Remember, Matthew was first. Matthew wrote in this style before Dickens was writing. Okay, Matthew was writing social reform literature before Oliver Twist, before Dickens was writing social reform literature. And I'm not sure what's in the Pickwick Papers because I haven't read them. There could be social reform in the Pickwick Papers, but those weren't his ideas. See, those were the ideas of his illustrator. You can get that out of my paper. I won't go too far into that. But Matthew was doing this before Dickens, and yet he has the humility here to consider himself the son of Dickens. See? And this is after Dickens had used A Christmas Carol, because this is 47, so this would be 4 years after that. But what we have is someone who writes in this style that we associate with Charles Dickens, although a crisper style technically, who has the heart, who has the real social reform compassion, who really is spiritual. In other words, this is the real Dickens, both historically and essentially. And yet he calls himself Dickens Jr. So I'm going to read just a little bit of this to give you an idea and puts a little bit of it up on the screen. What I have is library photographic copies. I have seen orphans whom I pitied and loved, but when I saw Florence Wragge sitting like an angel beside the dying bed of her mother, the only surviving relative left to her, and every moment carrying the soul of that fond and idolized mother nearer to its point of embarkation upon the returnless voyage of eternity. Note he doesn't believe in reincarnation at this point. And when I beheld the calm, heaven-like submission of Florence as she knelt to receive her parents' dying kiss and benediction, and as I listened to her words, "O mother, weep not thus. Jesus has promised to be the God and friend of the orphan, and although I am exceedingly grieved to part with you, yet I am submissive to the will of God. Beside, I believe God will permit your spirit to watch over me, the same after your death as now." Now, the mediums tell us this over and over and over if you've watched the mediumistic readings. "And you know, after you die, you will only move along as I do, for time and eternity are all one and run parallel until time is swallowed up of eternity." This is he's putting this in the mouth of a little girl. "I shall not see you because you will be a spirit, but you can see my spirit, and I shall feel happy in knowing that you are with me still." I repeat, when I listen to these words from the lips of the orphan-doomed Florence, then only in her 6th year, I felt for her almost a veneration. Now, again, this is the real author of A Christmas Carol. This is the original Dickens. This is the Dickens who is not a sensationalist, who truly is spiritual, who really has studied mysticism, as you see in the Christmas Carol, who really believes in spirits, who understands what the mediums tell us in their readings today. You will find exactly what he's expressed here through the mouth of that 6-year-old girl. You will find exactly the same thing being explained to us by Matt Fraser and all the other top flight mediums, John Edwards and so on. So that's the real Dickens. That's the author, or the co-author rather, of A Christmas Carol, who was taught by Abby Poyen, who was the real spiritual powerhouse of that story. Now, we're going to move to a poem signed Smike in the November 23, 1850 edition of the Boston Weekly Museum. This is a paper that Matthew had a very, very strong presence in. By style, I'm absolutely 100% certain that this is Matthew's poem. I have to figure out how to get this. I'm going to read from the original. And this is a monstrous-sized volume. This is the 1850 Boston Weekly Museum. So give me a minute to get myself situated here. Because I have to have my notes and that. This is, let's see, this is a November 23, 1850 edition. Now, here we go. I'm going to read this, and then we've got some commentary. I'm going to bring my light down somewhat. Hopefully I can read it small. They put the poems in smaller type, which is rather odd. Original, which means it was not copied from somewhere. A tribute to the memory. Oh, I'm reading the wrong one. Excuse me. Forget that. Here we go. Over here on page 191 in the volume is original, once again. The Winds, A Day in Autumn. I gotta bring this over here somewhere. Maybe I can see it. Now, this is written in Matthew's preferred meter. I went to great lengths very recently to read a whole bunch of poems of Matthew's in this same meter, which you will see in The Raven and in Lady Geraldine's Courtship. Variations, but nonetheless the same meter. It starts out, "It is autumn, chilly autumn, and the winds are on the wing. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's the meter. He uses that here. Here, the lines are strung out the way that you see in The Raven. I'll show it to you on the screen. This is a two-layered poem, as so many, if not all, of Matthew's works are. It talks about the winds in autumn. It compares them to thieves. This is really about plagiarists that have been plaguing Matthew. And there are hidden references in here. And it's an excellent poem. This is both serious and humorous, just as The Raven was. It is autumn, chilly autumn, and the winds are on the wing. They're a whisking and a frisking and a foul of everything. With a whistle they salute me, and my nose they coolly grasp. Oh, they bite me like a serpent, and they sting me like a wasp. And they shrug their wicked shoulders, and they chuckle in their sleeves at the new display of colors my poor nasal point receives. They have teased old Father Boreas till he's given them a spree, and they play the very Dickens with everything they see. They set the leaves a-flying o'er the grass-forsaken ground like a sinful congregation when the hat is passing round. And the saucy little rascals keep a-laughing in their sleeves at the rustling and the bustling they have made in italics a-turning leaves. Our old weathercock, poor fellow, he has had a sorry day. He would gladly turn and face them, but he could not tell which way. They've whirled him and they've twirled him till they've forced him from his roost, and, grown giddy with excitement, he has given up the ghost. And the wicked little wretches still are laughing in their sleeves at his melancholy corpus lying stark beneath the eaves. And the rickety old building that stood nodding to the skies, all in vain its solemn moanings, all in vain its stifled sighs, with a crashing and a smashing that goes booming through the town, it is openly assaulted and is rudely tumbled down. And the double-daring villains still keep laughing in their sleeve. Such a web of sad disasters ne'er an Argive loom could weave. But the worst of all their doings, with a shudder I repeat, they have whisked my nose so often you'd mistake it for a beat. And my teeth, they chatter with a hollow, deathly sound, like a watchman's rolling rattle as he walks his gloomy round. Oh, the wicked little rascals, they may chuckle in their sleeves, but all honest folks despise them as they would a band of thieves. Signed, Smike, S-M-I-K-E. Now, I was very unfamiliar with Dickens' works. I still am, but I ran across a little tidbit that Smike was one of Dickens' characters in Nicholas Nickleby. So here, in an article online from the Christian Science Monitor, written by Marjorie Cahey, the Monitor Books editor, February 7, 2012, she writes, it's an article entitled, Charles Dickens, His 10 Most Memorable Characters. And when we get to Smike, she says, Smike is one of a series of poorly treated innocents who haunt Dickens' fictive universe. Smike first appears in Dickens' third novel, Nicholas Nickleby, as a cruelly abused and severely disabled child who is unlucky enough to have been left at a, quote, school run by the villainous Wackford Squeers. Smike is rescued by the novel's title character and becomes fiercely loyal to him. Only when Smike has died does Nicholas discover that Smike was his own cousin, the son of his scheming uncle, Ralph Nickleby. Now, in other words, Matthew is portraying himself as a cruelly abused child, but he's hinting at a relationship. I hadn't picked that up until just now, but if I'm not mistaken, he's hinting at a relationship to Dickens, but he considers himself cruelly abused, see? Well, you can see that when Dickens created characters like this, he was being sensational. He was a sensationalist writer. Matthew was a spiritual writer who used the villains in his stories for moral education in the Victorian style. Dickens was not really a Victorian writer. He was a sensationalist writer. See? A Victorian writer, in the sense that I would use the term, was a moralist. Dickens was not really a moralist. He was a sensationalist, stealing and borrowing his morality from the people he plagiarized from. But anyway, let's go back to this poem and analyze it a bit. When Matthew italicizes anything, that's a double, not always, but generally it's a double entendre. It has a hidden meaning. Okay, it's code when he italicizes. It's supposed to be a pun, but usually it's more than just a pun. Well, here we have, and they play the very Dickens with everything they see. That's not italicized. It's lowercase. It probably was in common use at the time, for all I know. Was it intentional? Was it as far as he himself could go with his own suspicions, because Matthew would get into dark moods. What comes to mind is in the Narnia series by C.S. Lewis, there's a story called The Silver Chair. If I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I've read it, there's a prince who's captured by a witch, the Green Witch, I think it is, and he only comes to his senses in the middle of the night for an hour and realizes that a spell has been put on him, that he's been captured, he's been fooled. And during that 1 hour, he becomes, wild, and she has to tie him to the chair, if I remember correctly, and maybe gag him, I don't know, just for an hour. And then after that period, he comes back to his senses when he's still under the spell. See? Well, that's symbolic for somebody who tries very hard to believe in the way things are supposed to be, but deep down he knows something's wrong, and every once in a while his suspicions get the better of him. Well, that seemed to be happening to Matthew. Now, there's other italicized in here. When he says, at the rustling and the bustling, they have made a turning leaves, that's italicized. That means perusing other people's work. That's what a turning leaves. Leaves means pages, So he's talking about plagiarists, no question about it. I'm not imagining this, this is real. And of course, he compares himself to the poor weathercock, which is the melancholy corpus lying stark beneath the eaves. But it's the ending that fascinates me, because if I'm not mistaken, he's deliberately imitating Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Bells. So he's implicating Poe in this by style, not by name. I'm going to read the last stanza, and I'm going to emphasize it. Let's see if you agree with me. But the worst of all their doings, with a shudder I repeat, they have whisked my nose so often you'd mistake it for a beat. That's italicized too. If it has a hidden meaning, I don't know what it is. And my teeth, they chatter with a hollow deathly sound, like a watchman's rolling rattle as he walks his gloomy round. Oh, the wicked little rascals, they may chuckle in their sleeves, but all honest folks despise them as they would a band of thieves. I think that's a reference to Poe having stolen the Raven and Annabel Lee from him, see? So that's Matthew. That's the prince in the middle of the night for an hour. So now we move to a review that Matthew wrote of one of Dickens' public readings. This one was in New York City. He saw Dickens, he says, from the nosebleed section. I don't think he uses those terms, but from, he was finally able to get, a ticket for way up high in New York City. He couldn't get one in Boston, apparently. So he writes a review with his star. This is the same signature that he used in the New York Tribune from 1844 to 1846, which has been mistakenly attributed to Margaret Fuller. Matthew used the star from 1830 all the way to, I think it's 1873 or something like that. 1868, I think, was the last time he used the star signature. So he continues to use it well after Fuller's death, of course. And this is the January 4, 1868 Portland transcript, which he continued to submit to all his life, signed with a star. And what I have to do now is to close this volume of the Boston Weekly Museum. Remember, I haven't gotten to the part with the photographs yet. All right. So now, because when I got into the photographs and started looking up the background information, I remembered this stuff. Okay, the Portland transcript, January 4, 1868, written for the Portland transcript, original, with the star. Dickens Readings, New York, December 20, 1867. So that's when he wrote the article. He's signing it from New York on December 20. And I'm not going to read all of it. I went into this in my article, and there are subtle clues in there. While he's defending Dickens, or trying to, he's having trouble with it, but he's trying desperately to defend Dickens, but he leaves broad hints that he was the original author of A Christmas Carol, if you know what to look for, and if you've seen a dozen or dozens of examples of Matthew using code in other works, which I have. If you haven't ever seen Matthew use code before, you'll think I'm just reading that into it. But if you've seen 10, 20, 30 examples of Matthew embedding autobiographical information in code in his works, you'll know that that was also code. But I'm going to go down to where Matthew is defending Dickens. Mention might be made of Squeers and his delectable spouse, of Fanny in the schoolroom. He's talking about the different characters that Dickens apparently read. He did not read that, murder scene of Bill Sikes murdering Nancy, or he would have made a mention of that. I'm sure he wasn't allowed. The doctor wouldn't let him do it. The New York stage doesn't often show such a Scotchman as Browdy. It was perfection. Smike, too. The breathless hush with which the audience listened to his despairing exclamations showed the truthfulness of the rendering. You, quote, might have heard a pin drop, much more a cane. So he's desperately trying to believe that Dickens is sincere. That's what I get out of this. He mentions truthfulness. Apparently some people had questioned it, and Matthew's defending him. Then he says, Mr. Dickens' power of facial expression is wonderful. Now, he couldn't really see because he was way up in the nosebleed section. It is seen in the stolidity of Stairley, the grief of Bob Cratchit, the gobbling of Toots. His eye is very quick and expressive, and his smile has a charming naturalness that must be real. You see, he's trying, but he can't see. He's projecting these things because from where he was, he couldn't see Dickens' facial expressions because he tells us, I'll go back and find it, how far up he was. When at the close of the trial scene, he exclaimed, "Oh, Sammy, Sammy, why weren't there an alibi?" The soul of good humor so shone in his face that it was impossible to think it artificial. Again, he's desperately trying to believe that Dickens was genuine. It is pleasanter, too, to suppose it was genuine mirth, which the reader really shared with his audience. Then he says, some of the Sunday papers have been suggesting with a great deal of patriotic sarcasm that Mr. Dickens should read from Martin Chuzzlewit. They think the proposition a great joke. It is probable that the selections are permanently arranged, but if extracts from that book were to be read, they would be received good-naturedly, not because we are such incorrigible flunkies as those papers make us out to be, but because sensible people understand and appreciate some of the characters in that book. We laugh at Sniggins and Honorable Samuel Slumkey of Slumkey Hall. We smile at such native productions as Reverend Joseph Bellamy Stoker, and are we going to get us in a passion about the Jefferson Brink of 20 years ago? Signed, Star. So Matthew's coming to Dickens' defense, but let me see if I can find where he says how high up he was. It may take me a minute. It is undoubtedly true that some persons in each of Mr. Dickens' audiences are there merely from the motive of curiosity. To almost anyone, the fact that he has so much as seen the greatest living writer of fiction is something to be pleasantly remembered. It is also true that to sitters in the remote parts of such a hall as the Steinway, hearing is sometimes difficult, and appreciation of the wonderful expressiveness of Mr. Dickens' face quite impossible. In spite of these things, however, each successive reading has shown how thoroughly the mass of the people love the writer and delight in the reader. Now, actually, he doesn't say that he was up there. He kind of infers it, I would say. So I take that back. I don't have proof that he was up in the nosebleed section, although it's rather inferred. Try to be rigorous here. I try to tell people about my mistakes. When I find that something isn't as strong in evidence as I thought it was, I'm transparent about that. But since I do that, I should be given credit for the hits as well, see? It's not fair to disparage and jump on the mistakes or the areas that weren't as strong as I thought and ignore all of the strong points. See? So anyway, that's the review. And again, to my perception, clearly Matthew is desperately trying to defend his hero. Whether he was in a position to see Dickens' facial expressions at this point, I'm not sure. There may be some other references because he talks about getting a ticket and so forth and so on. I think as Quails, he talks about getting a ticket, if I'm not mistaken. And he may have mentioned there that he was only able to get a very poor seat. I'm not sure where I got that impression from, but this may not be the only example. So let's see. I think that is all I wanted to talk about there. I think the picture is very clear, in my opinion. that what we've got is someone who actually wrote in that style sincerely, in the style that's attributed to Dickens, with the motives that are attributed to Dickens, before Dickens began writing this kind of work. Now, whether Dickens could have been influenced by Matthew's young writing in the 1830 New York Constellation, I don't know. As I've said before, the farthest I could trace it is that the British Library does have a full run of the New York Constellation from those years, of all years, which runs from the end of 1829 through 1832, portion of 1832. They have the whole run. They don't know how they got it or when they got it or when it was donated or anything like that, whether they had it at the time or whether it was donated much later. It's odd that it would be donated later because it's an American newspaper. Normally, an American who had a full run of the Constellation and wanted to donate it to a museum would donate it to Houghton Library at Harvard or something like that, not to the British Library. So logically, whoever donated that to the British Library had it in England, in London probably, at the time, not America. That's my guess. I mean, we try to extrapolate with detective logic. That would be my guess, that it was around at the time. Now, I'm going to show some of my photography. And what I didn't prepare was that I don't have in front of me the evidence that Matthew was fascinated by photography and that he had a keen eye for art. But I will simply tell you that in his various pseudonyms, Matthew tells us that he loved to go to daguerreotype studios and look at the portraits. He had a keen eye for art. He critiqued art, sculpture, and painting, and so on. And when he went to Europe and went to Paris, where he visited in the home of Victor Hugo, the first person he got to know was Ernest Lacan. I don't know how it's pronounced, Lacan. I can't pronounce a French accent. Who was a writer, but he was also a photographer. And he launched either one or two of the first photography magazines in the world in Paris, right after, apparently, or the same year that Matthew met him in 1851 is when he did this. And apparently they hit it off and became good friends. So did Matthew inspire Lacan with an interest in photography? Did they, both share that interest? Is that why they, became buddies? We don't know. But what it does show is that Matthew had a very active interest in photography, and he had the aesthetics to be able to appreciate artwork. Then I think that I have had a more recent lifetime, the one that a psychic picked up on years ago, as a writer, a reporter, photographer on the West Coast. And I think that photographer had some contact with Ansel Adams and Edward Weston. So I can't prove any such thing. I can't locate this particular lifetime in history, but I seem to have quite a bit of information on it. I just can't locate it. But anyway, so it means that as this woman, I would have developed my interest in photography with the actual skills. So when I, in this lifetime, stumbled upon photography, and the way that happened was, and I'll show it here, I have to go find it. I was actually studying jazz piano and didn't have much aptitude for it. I was studying under a pretty good jazz teacher, Ted Howe, in Atlanta. I didn't really have the talent. And at a garage sale, I picked up an Instamatic camera, and I just went out and started shooting, and the light went off, and it was just like I know how to do this, and I had the vision, I had the eye, I had a natural eye. I'm going to show you a photograph that I've rendered black and white from my second roll of film out of this Instamatic camera, so you can see that I had a natural eye. Well, anyway, I'm going to show you some of my photography, and I'm not picking the best. What I'm choosing here is that I got bored. I didn't have anything to do the other day, a couple of days ago, and I said, well, why don't I go back into my old photographs that I'd scanned and do the darkroom work in Photoshop Elements, and clean them up, which is delightful. I used to do black and white printing, and what what an involved process that was, compared to what you can do now in Photoshop Elements, which cost me $25 or something, an older version, $20. So I did that. And these are all, with one exception, I think, they're all from a place called Calisaja Falls in North Carolina, which is near where my parents used to live in Franklin. And it's a magnificent falls, and the rest of them are details, but I'll show you a picture of the falls itself. I'm going to launch it right here. Let's see. So I can see it, but I'll put it up on the screen for you. And this is pretty much the whole falls, although you're not seeing the absolute bottommost tier of it here. It's like something out of an Oriental painting, magnificent. So let's see here. The reason I'm launching them is so I can talk about them and know that I'm talking about the right thing. This is the base of the falls, which you don't see in the previous photograph. This thing is so huge. Look how big just the foot is. This is just the bottom part that was cut off in the previous photograph. Now, I've worked with these a little bit in terms of tonality, a little dodging and burning and so on. Not much. A little cropping. One thing I've learned from Abby, and Abby can prompt me in cropping. I didn't do it this time, but she can actually prompt me, because I'll move the cursor over until I get a prompt, and I'll stop. That's where she wants it. And then I'll go to the top and move the cursor down. She says stop. See, so we can participate that way. And this is something that I have figured out ways around our situation. There are ways that we can continue a relationship. I mean, there's not a lot of things we can do together, but there are certain things, creative things, that we can do together, and that's just one example. This is called Tree Rocks, is what I just named them anything so that I'd know what I was looking at. This is along the stream. I think it's the stream that leads to the falls. And I think these speak for themselves. Ansel Adams refused to talk about any of his photographs. But the point that I would make is that, in my estimation, as a photographer, and I spent many years studying it, this is inspired work. It's excellent work. I wanted to use the word, the phrase world class, which is egotistical, but I'm being objective. This is serious work, okay? And I'm untutored. I'm not untutored in the sense that I did attend a club for a long time. And in the club, you submit photographs for the judge to judge. And when he judges, you get a critique. See, so you're getting free critiques on your work. And from that, I learned things like, if we're looking at this photograph, there's a couple things the judge might say. First off, the tree is awful close to the center, whereas you want things in the thirds. The exposure is pretty good. What you want is tonality in the darkest darks. You want detail in the darkest darks and the lightest lights, in that range, if at all possible. The shadow here to the right is a little muddy looking, but not too bad. But there's also something just to the left of the tree. There's something that evidences human intervention, what they call the hand of man. So if you're photographing, I'm remembering this from my participation in the club, if you're photographing nature, you want to really be aware of the hand of man in the photograph, and I missed that. That looks like something, a piece of concrete that somebody left there. It may not be, it may be natural. But otherwise, it's not quite dead center. It's kind of leaning off. Then you want to look at lines of force, Does your eye get pulled out of the picture, or does it get pulled over but then back in? So we have the tree leaning out of the picture, but then we have the shadow that kind of pulls you back in. The angles of the rocks kind of pull you in. A lot of this is cropping because you don't want things on the outside that are distracting, that pull you out. You want to pay attention to where does your eye go. Here, to me, my eye goes to this round turtle-looking rock that's embedded inside the tree, or behind the tree. But that's where my eye goes, or it goes down to the root of the tree, and it might go over to this hand of man thing off to the side. But if I go down, the curvature, the way the rocks are pointing, they bring me back up. Then you want contrast, where you've got little rocks on the bottom and a big rock on the top. You have rocks and a living being, the tree. You have the age, the age of the tree and the age of the rocks and so on. So there's thematic contrast in here. These are all the things that go into a photograph, but what actually goes into it when you photograph it is none of this stuff. It's sight. You see, you get excited, you feel it, and you shoot it. And then you go back and look and say, what was it I was seeing? What was getting me excited about this photograph? And then you start to analyze it, see? But this is what I mean by inspiration from the higher realms. You don't think about these things. The only things you think about is, what's my exposure? Do I have the focus? What's my depth of field? You want a technically, what's my lighting? You want a technically competent, thing. My shadow isn't in the picture, all the little technical details that come in. That's what you're thinking about. But the intelligence in it comes from somewhere else. You just feel it and you shoot it, the best ones, you don't think about these things. So I'm trying to give an objective presentation of something that is beyond objective explanation. Here is something called dried puddle. I just called it that, but this is for me to know what I was looking at. I'm going to turn this Kindle sideways and put on my glasses. This is an interesting shot. Now, I've got some kind of cross-hatching in here. I'm not sure what that is. I'll have to see if it's in the original and fix it. I can't exactly tell you what's exciting about this image. I'm not exactly sure what it is. I think it's a puddle that's dried up. It's like shale under there, but it's granite around the outside with shale in the middle. So I don't understand. Geologically, I don't understand what this is. But it's texture, it's patterns, it's the contrast between these little shale rocks and these big kind of encroaching or guarding granite rocks, And again, with the tonality, we've got a little bit of detail everywhere except this shadow that comes down. I'd love to have a little detail in the shadow on the upper right. I don't have it. The stick on the left is a little distracting. I've got detail in the lichen and in the brightest rocks down here. There's still some detail in those. Beyond that, it's kind of hard to say what it symbolizes to me, but it means something. Like the rocks on the outside, it's like discovering something that's been protected or been hidden or been revealed or something like that. You can't really put these things into words. These rocks are in the third. When you grid out a photograph, ideally you want whatever your eye goes to be in one of the thirds. It gives it a dynamic feel instead of a static feel. How these rocks were, I guess they were strata. I don't know how they ended up being elongated like that and yet embedded vertically. I don't know how you take horizontal stratified rock and embed it vertically, some kind of cataclysm or something, or the power of the water that used to be there. I don't know. This is kind of a study in scale and shape and texture. I've rendered it fairly high contrast. It wasn't in the slide that I pulled from, and it excited me. Very tough thing to articulate. There should be another one in here, bush rock. Okay, this I think might not have been taken there. I'm not sure where this was taken. It could have been that same place. But obviously the sense of contrast, it's in the thirds, lower third more or less. And there's a dynamic quality to the rock. It looks like it's flowing somehow. It may even have been volcanic rock. I have no idea. I don't know what kind of rock this is or how it was formed. I'm not a geologist. But there's a dynamic quality to the rock. There's a big crack here. And in that crack is this dried bush, whether it's alive or dead or it's just a seasonal thing, we don't know. But it's also has a flowing motion like fire. The rocks are kind of like water and the bush is kind of like fire, and yet both of them are seemingly dead and both of them are seemingly inert, and yet they look like they have motion in them. Totally different texture because the bush is like brittle and the rocks are solid. And it's like, it's also like survival, like there's nothing surviving in this rock except where there's a crack in the rock. Something, life has managed to come up through this thing, as much as it is like the rock itself. Somehow life has come up through this crack in the impermeable rock. See? So there's some beautiful thematic things going on here. I didn't see any of that. I was excited. I saw something. I felt something. I shot it. I came, I saw, and I shot. That's what it's like. And then you go back and you say, man, this has some interesting symbolism in it, Now, I also used to take candids. I would go to festivals, art festivals, one in Atlanta in particular, and I learned fairly quickly that if you move around, and you have a lens, at least 100, I used to use a 135 millimeter lens, which is enough to get you away from the subject to where they're not really noticing you, or at least they don't notice you at the crucial point. And I had manual focus equipment, so I would focus on something of equal distance, somewhere over here. I would turn around and shoot. I get my exposure and everything ready, see? And I turn around and shoot quickly. And it was amazing the things I would just, again, intuitively, I would see something. I didn't know what it was. So every once in a while, I would shoot a fellow photographer. This guy apparently is a professional. I don't know why I'm not able to launch this thing. Let's see. That's odd. It's giving me a check, but it's not launching the actual photograph. So I have to go from memory on this. This is pretty interesting, partly because of the guy to his left, as I recall it, looking up at something else. So you've got lines of force. When people are concentrating on something, you have lines of force. So this guy's looking at something. We don't know what it is, but he's not looking at what the photographer's looking at. The photographer sees something. This is the moment that I'm talking about, captured in another person. So I'm having the moment about him. He's having the moment about something else. See? So he's got that inspiration. He sees something and he's getting his camera out and ready. No doubt he's got everything technically set up because this guy knows what he's doing. You can just tell. Now, this fellow is in his 50s. That was 30 years ago, I'm guessing, which means that if he's still alive, he's in his 80s now. This is fascinating about photography. But this guy's at the peak of his abilities, the top of his game, and he sees something, and he's about ready to shoot it, and I've captured it. He's looking at this. Other guy's totally distracted looking at something else. He's kind of like the world that doesn't see the inspiration, see? So thematically also, this, has some depth to it. And of course, the depth is partly a function of which ones you keep. But there was one famous photographer. His name started with a W. I don't remember who it was, but he did his photography by just snap, 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 snap. He, took thousands and thousands of photographs, and then he would go through the rolls and look for the ones that were worthwhile. That's valid. That's his technique. I think people kind of look down their nose at it a little bit, but hey, he got results, Well, this kind of photography is not, because I only had like one shot of this guy. I only had one opportunity to get this shot. See, this shot, you don't have time to think about, what does this mean? And look, this other guy's looking the other way. And it wasn't an accident because I only took the one shot. I saw it and I shot it, ask questions later, and I had trained myself. This is training for your intuition. This is what photography did to me. It was intuition training. See, I had trained my intuition to the point where I could see these things, and I didn't know what they were until after I'd hit the button, but I got it. So that's my photography. Now, there's a poignant aspect to this, and that is that I'm good enough to be world known. I don't world famous. I don't know. Who cares about world famous? But I'm good enough to be recognized on a world level, at the world stage, as a photographer. And yet, I've never had anybody have the wow response that I can think of about my photography. I've sold like one or two. I had a few in a gallery for a little while because the gallery owner knew it was good. Nobody bought it, of course. He told me nobody buys photography. But I've never been recognized for my photography. Well, it's kind of scary in a sense because, what if I'm never recognized for this MFW work that I'm doing ever, just like the photography? But I got the hit from Abby recently. She says, you are not supposed to be known for your photography. In other words, because it would have taken me down a different road. See, that wasn't supposed to happen. But it does show how Mathew Franklin Whittier's fascination with photography, including his friendship with Ernest Lacan, how that developed into the ability that I have now within a couple lifetimes, probably with some tutoring from Edward Weston, maybe a little bit from Ansel Adams, I'm guessing. I just feel that. And I know that this person ended up on the West Coast. And I'm pretty sure that she was both a photographer and a reporter. One of these days, maybe I'll identify her because I think I know how she died. I'll say that for the record. What I remember about her death was she had a little car, like a sporting car. We're talking 1830 something. And it had a radio in it, which I thought, was, well, that kills it right there. But I looked it up. No, cars in that era did have radios. And like Mathew, like myself, she was deeply sensitive to music. So there was some song she was listening to, and when she got to where she was going, it wasn't finished. So she leaned her chair back, if the chairs back then would lean back, which I don't know, and closed her eyes and finished listening to the song. Well, she had forgotten to pull a handbrake, which apparently was essential in those old cars, and the car rolled backwards down off some kind of embankment, and she was killed. I have searched online for every permutation of that, and I have never come up with it. But what I would need to do, if I was so inclined, was to go into, I think it's San Francisco. And there's another reason why I think it's San Francisco that I won't go into right now. Because there was somebody I recognized that did work. Well, there was somebody I recognized who did work to end Chinese slavery of, girls that were being used as sex slaves. And I recognized her immediately, very strongly. Donaldson, I think her name was. I can't remember the first name. There's like a nickname. Something Donaldson. So anyway, I recognized her in her later years. And I said, I knew her. And Mathew, of course, was an abolitionist. So I think that whoever I was in that lifetime would have written journalistic pieces about her. So if I went back into I'm pretty sure it's San Francisco, into the San Francisco newspapers of the 30s, and looked for all the articles that had to do with this woman and her anti-slavery work with the Chinese population, and looked for a byline, I might be able to find it. I'm busy with what I'm doing now. I haven't delved into that lifetime that much, but that would be the way to do it. Anyway, it took a couple lifetimes from Mathew's interest in daguerreotypes and photography to this lifetime on the West Coast in the 1920s and 30s to my current lifetime for that skill in photography to develop. So, there's a history to that. Anyway, that's all. What are we at, 55 minutes? We're at about an hour. Now, how many hour-long programs have you watched? How many movies, how many hour-long things on YouTube that were basically, either they were sensational or they were inane? Surely people can watch what I'm doing for an hour, It's, I do ramble a bit, but still, I'm proving reincarnation, and I'm proving that Charles Dickens just, sensationalized the original of A Christmas Carol that wasn't his, and a whole bunch of other interesting things, and surely people can hang out with me for an hour. I think they will in the future. And some of you guys are, because the average includes people that click out after the first 3 minutes, and it averages it in with people who watch the whole show or watch 30 minutes. So it's kind of hard to tell from averages. I wish they actually gave you stats as opposed to averages, and you'd get a much better idea what was going on. So this was a little bit disjointed. I'm sure there's things that I wanted to talk about that I didn't. The gist of the first one is that Mathew was a lifelong fan of Dickens, even though Mathew was the real Dickens and Dickens was the imitator. Mathew didn't have that much self-confidence, and in his humility, he styled himself as Dickens Jr., but he would occasionally get suspicious and express those suspicions around the corner as hidden code in some of his works. And the second point is just that, I've objectively shown you what inspired work is. I talked about it but I've now shown it to you. So we did a little show and tell on what inspired work is. A Christmas Carol was originally inspired work. Dickens was incapable of writing in that vein, in that way. He wasn't an inspired writer. He was a sensational writer. And he wrote about people being abused, and he wrote about people being murdered, and that was where his mind was. That's where his heart was. When he wrote anything that was uplifting, it was either for the sake of melodrama or he plagiarized it. I've still gotten a few more names of people to write to, including a couple of Dickens' descendants. I just found the contact information for the great-great-great-granddaughter of Dickens. These people are not going to be happy. They're not going to be pleased with me. Now, I don't know what they might try to do. I have to be a little careful in terms of what I could get sued for, I don't think you can get sued for anything you say about a historical character. I certainly could be sued for anything I say about those people that was defamatory, So I have to be a little bit careful. But I've made the decision to send to everybody because I want everybody to be on the same playing field. I want everybody to have been given the opportunity to see the information, and to know that it's been published. That's partly because if somebody else gets this idea, they'll know that I was first. It's partly because people talk, and leavening, what I'm doing is leavening. I'm putting it out there, and most of it's going to just not be looked at or be dismissed. But out of 600 people now, I got about 600 names. Surely out of 600, somebody's going to actually read the article. And when he reads the article, the light bulb's going to go off, and he's going to say, by gosh, I think he's right, And all it takes is a few to spoil the soup. So that's the plan. We've still got, this is the third. I'm not going to start until the 15th or 16th or something like that, which would be roughly a month after the article appeared in Real Paranormal Magazine UK, which I don't have I don't even have a verbal agreement to that effect, although I've told them that's what I'm going to do. But I think that's fair. Give them that magazine a month or so to sell, because they're even giving their first edition, they're even giving that away now. So, they're on board with the principal, charge for it for a while, and then at some point, give it away for promotions. So that's the plan. I don't have a whole lot to do right now. I'm kind of taking it easy, but in 2 weeks, I'm going to be very, very busy, probably too busy to do any of these entries. However, I did get online and look at Evergreen Cemetery, where these various people that were important in Matthew's life are buried. Their shell is buried. And I know exactly where those markers are. So when the weather gets a little bit better, and already spring is starting to spring here, when it gets better and spring is well underway and we get a nice dry day, I'm going to take originals as much as possible, put them in the car, drive to each of those tombstones, and get my cell phone out and read from those originals in front of each marker, one at a time. And it may take me several visits to get the whole thing finished, but when I get it finished, it should be kind of an interesting, poignant entry. That's a little bit for the future. I imagine we're talking at least a couple weeks, if not more. Maybe I'll do that as kind of a break from sending all the emails. So once again, thanks for watching.